Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Yulia Panfil, and I'm the director of the Future of Land and Housing program at the think tank New America. Welcome, and thank you for joining us for this webinar, which we've convened jointly with the National League of Cities to discuss how you can use ARPA funds to improve your understanding of evictions in your communities. Over the last several years, working closely with cities and counties, we've seen how access to eviction data and analysis really does make a difference in the ability to craft better policies and more effectively target resources to keep people housed. And we've also seen that having this data available can be useful in building political will, unlocking previously deadlocked conversations, and really putting new solutions on the table when it comes to eviction prevention. And so the focus of this webinar will be very practical, and that is how you can use these ARPA funds to build this data capacity and to put in place systems and processes that will allow you to continue tracking evictions even after this cash infusion has expired. As you know, most of these funds must be obligated by the end of this year, though you do have until the end of 2026 to spend them down. So now is really the time to be thinking through what to do with the funds that you have remaining. As a quick preview of the next hour, we'll first share a little bit about the nuts and bolts of why improving local data on evictions is an allowable use of these funds, and also some options for how you can use these funds to build your eviction data capacity. We'll hear from the city of Alexandria, Virginia, which used ARPA funds to stand up a citywide evictions dashboard, and importantly, to create a new position for a data analyst who would be able to maintain this dashboard. And we'll share two specific tools and opportunities that New America has available to help you collect and analyze eviction data. In a moment, I will turn it over to Lauren Lowry, the Director of Housing and Community Development at the National League of Cities, who will say a few words about the strategies that NLC members have been using to improve eviction data in their jurisdictions, and also some of the opportunities from NLC and elsewhere to keep doing this. We'll then hear from Karen Lash, a senior fellow at the Georgetown Justice Lab and former DOJ official. Karen will take us through the practicalities of how to make the case that improving eviction data is an allowable use of funds, some of the deadlines and other things that you should be aware of, and so forth. We'll then turn to a case study from Alexandria, Virginia, which has used ARPA funds to stand up an eviction database. We'll hear from Catherine Key, a performance analyst with the city, and Mary Horner, Housing Justice Senior Staff Attorney at the Legal Services of Northern Virginia, who can tell us about how they did it. And finally, my colleague Sabiha Zainalbai, Deputy Director of Domestic Housing at New America, will talk about two concrete tools and opportunities that New America has available to help you on this journey. We will wrap with ample time for questions from the audience, and we'll make sure to leave all of our contact information so that you can get in touch with us after the fact. Finally, before turning it over to Lauren, I just wanted to quickly touch on the variety of ways in which you can actually use these funds to improve eviction data capacity. We'll get into some of these in more detail later, but among them, you can use these funds to help clean, compile, and analyze court eviction data, just as the city of Alexandria did. You can conduct a local eviction data needs assessment to identify data gaps and strategies for filling them. You can use the funds to manually convert public records, whether from a public website or from physical files, into a usable electronic format, or you can automate manual processes required to work with court eviction data. You can use the funds to develop data sharing processes across government agencies in your jurisdiction and promote interoperability. Courts can also upgrade their case management systems, standardize the way court data is collected and reported, or train court clerks to uniformly record eviction data so that it's easier to work with further on down the line. So just to say that there are a lot of ways in which these funds can be used, and hopefully this webinar will provide some concrete ways that you can take this work forward. And with that, I am pleased to turn things over to my colleague, Lauren.
Thank you, Yulia. And thank you for joining New America National League of Cities for today's webinar. As mentioned, my name is Lauren Lowry. I'm the Director of Housing and Community Development at National League of Cities. This webinar comes at a critical time. Rents are rising, evictions are still happening, and there is still more work to be done. And the obligation deadline for ARPA is approaching. With that said, it's now more important than ever to invest in solutions that can assist your community with tackling evictions, such as the local eviction database. And I hope from today's webinar, you leave with a wealth of knowledge about how to implement a local eviction database in your community. Along with this information, I hope you take away a couple of resources from NLC. One is understanding your local eviction landscape, a worksheet for city officials that can be applied to any community. This worksheet could be a starting place for your community as it gathers its eviction data. Lastly, I would like to point out our resource, the Eviction Prevention, a guide for local governments. This guide offers a comprehensive, detailed way as to how to shape your eviction prevention strategy. It has information from the types of interventions that should occur before, during, and after eviction to how you think through outreach strategies to how to fund your eviction prevention strategies. Thank you. And now I'm going to pass it to Karen Lash to talk about ARPA.
Thank you, Lauren. I am delighted to join this webinar that we hope will inspire you to mobilize around a key component for developing policies to keep people housed by making sure that it's informed by data about what's really happening with evictions in your jurisdiction. So my role is to address a chief obstacle to creating an eviction database or just ways to clean, compile, and analyze court eviction data, identify those data gaps that Yulia was talking about, and how to fill them. And that chief obstacle is money. So here's the roadmap. Terrific. Actually, next slide. For what I'm going to talk about, which is we'll start with a quick review of the American Rescue Plan Act, or ARPA, and its state and local fiscal recovery funds that ARPA authorized, and explain why I'm focusing on those particular funds. And then I'll give just a minute to community development block grant funds as a kind of plan B source of funding to the fiscal recovery funds, and then I'll briefly mention some possible next steps now that you know what funds could be tapped. So we start with a quick review. It's 2021, the pandemic is still raging, and Congress passes ARPA, which authorizes an unprecedented amount of resources to combat the health, economic, and racial equity challenges that were exacerbated by the coronavirus. So ARPA itself included a vast array of programs and grants in its $1.9 trillion relief package, and it included lots of housing-related funds and programs folks on this call would be familiar with, like the Emergency Rental Assistance Program, Homeowners Assistance Fund. There were emergency housing vouchers and many more. But the largest and most flexible source of funds was the $350 billion for state, local, and tribal governments, the state and local fiscal recovery funds. So next slide. I'm focusing on fiscal recovery funds for three reasons. First is that some jurisdictions get three bites at the apple. If you happen to live in a populous urban area where the state, county, and the city each got allocations of fiscal recovery funds, you have several targets. Second is that many jurisdictions haven't decided what they are doing with all of their fiscal recovery funds yet. The latest Treasury Department's fiscal recovery fund spending data is a little old, but it's still instructive. It's as of June 30th of last year. It shows that about half of fiscal recovery funds have yet to be spent, and that amount goes up for local governments. More than 56% of funds were unexpended. So third is, as was mentioned, there's a deadline for making those decisions. So all fiscal recovery funds must be obligated by the end of 2024. Obligated means committing the funds to an activity that's allowed by the requirements of the grant. So funds have to be obligated before the jurisdiction can draw those funds down or disperse them. And if they aren't obligated by the end of this year, 2024, the Treasury Department will claw back the remaining funds. I call that a policy or fiscal felony, metaphorically speaking, of course. And while those funds have to be obligated by the end of this year for your jurisdiction to keep them, the government still have until the end of 2026 to actually spend them, which is pretty terrific. So that's the overview of the funding source. But like all federal funding sources, there are constraints on how the funds can actually be spent, right? Congress determines the purpose of the funds. The administering federal agency, in this case, the Treasury Department, they add all the details through rules and regulations and guidance and different kinds of guidance like FAQs, and they have reporting requirements and audit authority. But the good news is that with the fiscal recovery funds, there's just no ambiguity really about whether the local and state governments can use these funds for eviction data related activities. It is absolutely an eligible use of these funds. So on the next slide, the Treasury Department's rules and regs and guidance don't ever say any place eviction database, for example, but there's plenty of language in those sources that makes it clear it's an eligible use of these funds. So profound apologies for breaking every rule of effective PowerPoint slides, but I wanted you to have my favorite language that comes out of these the Treasury rules and guidance. And at the bottom of these slides are the URLs to actually find it yourself. So there's two big buckets of language that get us to this is an eligible use. And the first is the substance related language. So the language from the Treasury Department's final rule has all this clarification and about eviction prevention services. So, and it includes all of this on the slide. It's a non-exhaustive list of what can fall under eviction prevention services. But I've bolded some of my favorite language here relevant to us because, I mean, arguably you need good data to do any of these eviction prevention services, but I popped out things like case management related to housing stability, because that's a lot of data collection, legal aid for eviction proceedings, and specifically that it's allowed to spend on court-based eviction prevention or eviction diversion programs. And they specifically name court systems among those that can implement eviction prevention strategies. So this slide's language is at the link. Okay, the next slide is the second bucket of relevant language, and it's where the Treasury Department explains in its eligible use section of the overview of their final rule, where they make clear the allowability of public sector use. So that's the government, and that includes courts. So there are they enumerate three categories of eligible uses by the public sector, and the third is effective service delivery. I could have bolded this whole section too, But I just note that the language clearly includes data, gathering data, using data, program evaluation, technology for effective services, and staffing for all of it. And I'd also note that a court can use its funds for its own staff, but it doesn't have to. It can hire external contractors to help them with that. Okay, next slide. So that was fiscal recovery funds. I'm just giving 1 minute for another source of locally administered federal funds. Those are HUD's Community Development Block Grants, CDBG funds as a plan B if fiscal recovery funds for some reason are just not available. And so I've got some links to the HUD manuals about CDBG's eligible activities that expressly allows funds for data gathering and planning activities, as long as they are advancing CDBG housing goals and for low and moderate income people. So there's also a link on this slide for the State Justice Institute has a court funding toolkit, and I created the content in that toolkit about all of the federal pass-through formula funds. And so there is a section both on fiscal recovery funds in that toolkit, but also on CDBG. And in that section, there's help for finding who your local administrator of CDBG funds are, for example. That's kind of information that's there. So anyway, it's a potentially another bite at the federal funding apple. So on the next slide. Okay, so now you know you can use these funds for an eviction database and eviction data collection, cleaning, analyzing. So you've got what you need to make that case. So now what? I'm going to skip over the really hard part, which is developing a proposal and identifying the right mix of partners for your jurisdiction, and just close this out by focusing on some of the mechanics around the money and how to think about getting some of this money. So for fiscal recovery funds, you really want to know who, in addition to your state, got an allocation. Did your county get it? Did your city get it? Did your tribe get an allocation? And so to get some information about those questions, you've got some links on this slide. And the Treasury Department's public reporting data dashboard actually also gives you some ideas about what jurisdictions are spending their funds on. I always like to look at those. Next is who's the decision maker for obligating and spending the fiscal recovery funds. In the beginning, like the first year or so of fiscal recovery funds, it was all over the maps, hard to figure it out who and how is spending the money. And now it's a discoverable process. So this is just about doing some of your research to find spending priorities and figuring out your best partners and champions. So here, there's some more links. A big shout out to National League of Cities, who worked with Brookings and NACO on a really fabulous website. That link is here. You can get more insights about your jurisdiction. And so you also want to find out, if you can, if yours is a jurisdiction that does still have unobligated funds. This is a little tricky to find out, very idiosyncratic. Some local jurisdictions have a lot of public transparency around this stuff and have dashboards. Most, not so much. So it may come down to using your local contacts to learn more. Okay, my last comment is, let's say you learn that fiscal recovery funds at all levels in your jurisdiction have all been obligated. Don't give up. You want to find out more about who the recipients are. So for example, if the courts got a lump sum for a variety of purposes, or the local housing agency or a university doing housing work or housing services nonprofits that got funds. There still may be flexibility in those budgets to include systems for tracking evictions and data analysts in order to guide eviction and housing policy. So, and I've been told that there are some courts who are still figuring out how to spend what they've been given. So now you know you can use these funds for eviction data and collection, cleaning, analyzing. So you got what you need to make the case. I am so happy to pass it off to what I think is much more interesting, which is hearing from Catherine and Mary in Alexandria, Virginia, about how they did it.
Thank you, Karen. So my name is Mary, Mary Horner. It's a pleasure to be here. I am a housing justice senior staff attorney with Legal Services of Northern Virginia. We are a legal aid organization with multiple offices in the Northern Virginia area. Just some background, the genesis of how this kind of happened. So prior to the pandemic and kind of for the first 2 years of the pandemic, I have been the only legal aid attorney handling housing, consumer, and elder law cases within the city of Alexandria. For those who do not know, we have a population of just under 160,000 with about a 60% rental population. At that time, prior to COVID, and really my primary caseload was dealing with public and subsidized housing cases, and typically for issues other than rent, so lease violations, behavioral, mental health issues, in addition to my other casework. But then when the pandemic hit, the court system shut down, as for most people, from about March until mid-March till around July 1st. And we knew that in that time, there were over 500 cases that were essentially stuck in the court system, plus many, many, many more that we knew were going to be filed immediately as soon as the court system opened back up. Also, because so many people could not work and had lost work at that time. Also during that time, the legal landscape completely changed. For those who do not know, Virginia is historically been regarded as a very landlord-friendly state. We don't have a lot of the same legal protections that other states have. But suddenly we had all of these state and federal protections that had not been applicable before. So we had the CARES Act, the 60-day continuance bill in Virginia, of course, the CDC moratorium when that was implemented. But for majority of, if not all of those legal protections, a tenant actually had to show up to a court or affirmatively assert their right by filling out a form or bringing some type of proof or affidavit. So they needed to know about those legal protections and then assert them. Also, we had an influx of both local and then followed by state rental assistance that we wanted to make sure we were able to connect tenants to, because that had not existed prior. So it was trying to figure out how we could really focus on those tenants that were at the most risk of evictions to get them connected with resources. So it really struck me that in order to reach the greatest number of people possible and to have the greatest impact, we really needed to have data in order to plan and implement any sort of strategy. Virginia is very lucky that we do have an online case system in our general district court, which is where evictions take place. You can find traffic court information, credit card debts, and eviction cases. But there wasn't anyone who was actually tracking that data or organizing it so that we could make use of it at that time. So kind of out of self-preservation and again, realizing we needed to organize that data so we could help address the eviction wave that was going to hit us. I actually started manually pulling that data offline in order to track the number of filings that we had each week, the highest filing properties, what were the results of cases, were people getting judgments, and if so, what was the amount of the judgment? At the time, I did this for about just over a year. I was basically putting everything into Excel spreadsheets and creating our own very rudimentary database. And then I was sharing that information out with our community partners and city stakeholders so that we could, to support the different initiatives. So using this data, it took a lot of time to pull that data offline because not only is it on one actual website, but you have to click into every single individual case to pull a lot of the information off. But using this data, what we were able to do in that year, we were able to support the efforts of others by sharing our eviction data with our newly, at the time, it's newly created Eviction Prevention Task Force, which was initially just a small handful of community service providers and city agencies, but it has grown exponentially over the years, which is wonderful. We were able to establish a court outreach program. Initially, we had a table outside in the heat and the snow until we were able to get our vaccinated and go inside. But at that table, we were able to share various legal protections, which often changed from week to week for those who were in the courts at the time. We were able to help tenants apply for and expedite rental assistance applications, both at court and by focusing on those high filing properties. We were able to partner with landlords and set up on-site outreach regularly every single week at those high filing properties, so we could work with landlords as well. We encouraged the court to consolidate their eviction dockets to streamline services. We used to have to go to court 4 days a week, every afternoon. We were able to convince them with the data that, you know, we could really boil this down to 2 and potentially even 1 in the future days a week, and then also convince them to segment the docket, because at first everyone was coming at 1:30, but now our dockets are every 30 minutes, so that we are able to provide, we only have 30 cases per docket, so we're able to provide individual assistance to people as they come to court. We were also able to partner with the court and the sheriff to include information about rental assistance and legal assistance on all filings that were served, both through the sheriff's office and private process service. We were also able to work with the sheriff's office with regard to the selection of and also rescheduling of eviction dates, especially because what we were finding is that people were getting approval for rental assistance, but the physical check had not quite made it by the time maybe an eviction was going to be scheduled. So being able to work with the sheriff's office, having that data, knowing what date they were going to be evicted, we were able to work with them have them exercise the discretion to move those dates and avoid eviction. And although we were able to accomplish a lot with that data in that time, it took an incredible amount of time, hours and hours per week and all weekend, to manually pull the data. Since, to be honest, I have a legal background. I do not have any data science background or data analyst background. I knew that if somebody had that capability, they could speed up this process immensely, but I did not have that. So about a year into this, we had the opportunity to present our efforts to City Council, and they had many questions regarding the data, and there were questions I was not able to answer, a lot of them, because I'm not a data analyst. And although I could create a pivot table, that's about the extent of what I was able to do when we had hundreds of, dozens, if not hundreds of different Excel spreadsheets. But once City Council saw the utility of the data, they decided to invest in data infrastructure in the city. And that's how we thankfully ended up with Catherine Key in August of 2021, who I will pass it off to now.
Thanks, Mary. I think Mary gave a great overview of all that Alexandria and our city and non-city partners were able to do. But I think when the City Council decided to invest in a data analyst specifically for eviction work, it really saw kind of 3 major things that came out of that. One was our ability to really scale from the data. So I started in August of 2021, as Mary said. And for those of you who are in this line of work at that time, you'll remember that's also when we had the eviction moratorium end. So we were able to take all of these. I just started and really took over that manual work from Mary. So being able to take off that administrative burden, when that moratorium ended kind of suddenly by the Supreme Court, I was able to really flip and really quickly be able to produce a list of residents truly who were along in the process and were going to be most vulnerable because they had been in court within 30 days or 60 days or 90 days. I don't remember the exact, and then able to really quickly allocate resources to them. That's a process that probably would have taken someone who didn't have a data background a lot longer. So we were able to scale a lot of our efforts. I think another thing is that sustainability of it. So when I came in, one of the first things that I did, in addition to taking some of that manual labor off, was to do a landscape study of what the data landscape looked like. We knew that there were lots of different avenues that we could pursue, that kind of online, copying and pasting was just one way. Because I had time to do that, like landscape study and look through things, I talked to our court system to see if there was a way they would give us access to the data. I talked to the state. I talked to some other data partners that were doing this again at the state level, some universities, and really found that what was going to be useful for us was to create, to build our own scraper, to continue to take that data. So what I did, it took me almost a year because I'm a data analyst, not necessarily a coder or a developer. But what I did was able to build a scraper that took something that was taking Mary, 8 hours a week or to do by hand, and bring it down to about 1 hour of the scraper running on my computer. I send it Friday nights, and then 15 minutes of sending it through some code to clean it. So it took a process that was taking many hours and really condensed it to, like I said, a few minutes, half an hour maybe. And so being able to have that sustainability was really something that we were able to build out. And even as I've rolled off of being exclusively ARPA funded and now been brought into the city as kind of a more generalist data analyst, I'm still able to support the eviction work pretty consistently because we had done that sustainable work to figure out where we wanted to go. I think the other thing is that I'll advocate for why it was good for us to have me, in the city rather than in a different position, is that I was given a lot of additional access kind of behind the city's firewall. I think one, that also is a signal from our city council and our city manager that they were really serious about this because they put funds into it. Therefore, I was able to break down a lot of silos that have traditionally existed within our city data. So whether that's with the court system or the sheriff department is a great example of that. Our sheriff's department is connected, but not necessarily under the city manager. But because of having the backing of our city council and the express purpose that this was a priority for them, I was able to get access to the sheriff's data. So not just what was happening on this like public court website, but we were finally being able to see in a systematic way, okay, what happens after someone gets rid of eviction? Are they self-evicting? Are they actually ending up paying in that last 60 days or last 30 days? And so they're not being removed from their homes. So that gave us that kind of critical last data point within that. And so I'll say that one of the things that have been great for the data, the way that we do it, we both have that kind of like operational data that was very much of like a list of people that had unlawful detainers filed that week, a list of people who had writs of eviction, so that we could share that, as Mary was talking about, in a very operational way, so that our community partners could look at this list and say, oh, I know that person, I'm going to call them, or we see that we need to allocate, or we need to go talk to people at this property and make sure that they get signed up for rental assistance. As that has kind of wind down, because we have, there's not really the rental assistance in the same way that there was, we've really been able to also use this data to focus on kind of the trends. So I've built the Alexandria eviction trends dashboard that I think we'll be sharing. And I think that really allowed us a couple of additional things. One was evaluation. So we were able to see some of our other programs to see, were they really making a difference? Were people who were coming in contact, whether that is our with legal services like Mary or with our service navigators, were we seeing better outcomes for them? Another thing was we were really able to use these trends to connect to other areas within housing instability. So we use this data and I share it on a monthly basis with our homelessness services, that we're able to see, like, to talk with them and make that connection between the people who are facing eviction to the people who are entering our shelters in our city, and also citing eviction is one of those reasons. So that's been a real like connecting thread that we've been able to do. And then finally, I think another thing for the sustainability aspect of it, having this like visual that is shared consistently and with high quality data that we all kind of trust and move forward, has really been a launching point for us to be able to advocate for additional funding outside of the ARPA. So into our normal budget cycle, thinking about, how can we continue to give rental assistance to some of our residents, or how can we invest in other programs, whether it's diversion programs, as well as honestly applying for funding. I know, Mary, we've used some of this data to do some state grants and things like that, and those ways to make it sustainable moving forward.
And then just one final little plug before we pass it to Sabia. So the final thing is, now that we have some of the load off of us, we've also been able to focus on, I know expungement work and sealing is something that's really important for a lot of us. So we've been able to, because we have this information basically just handed to us every week, we can do that research, look up those who are eligible for expungement. And since now we continue our outreach at court, we've been able to help over tenants complete over 1,000 expungements in the last year and a half. So that's been also really great.
Yeah, thank you so much, Mary and Catherine, for sharing that example. So before we jump into your questions, we wanted to take just an opportunity to share 2 potential resources that New America has to offer jurisdictions who are interested in advancing their eviction data infrastructure. So I'm just going to share my screen quickly. And so, over the last several years, we have partnered with over a dozen cities, counties, and states to help those jurisdictions access their eviction data, analyze it, and then provide meaningful analysis to the public and to housing communities at the local level, oftentimes in the form of dashboards, sort of similar to what Mary and Catherine just described. And so, again, yeah, just wanted to share 2 potential opportunities. So first, for jurisdictions that have access to their eviction data specifically, but might not have the capacity or the technical resources to be able to continuously be working with this data and analyzing it, we, New America, and an organization called DataKind have developed a tool called the Foreclosure and Eviction Analysis Tool, and it is intended to do just that, which is upload data, eviction data at the local level, and build the capacity for data to drive policy and programming on an ongoing and hopefully seamless basis. So I'll just there's a web application for this tool. It's meant to be, as I just said, incredibly seamless. So essentially what it does in a nutshell is it allows users to upload their eviction data, clean it, and geocode that data at the census tract level, and produce key insights that allow people to understand where evictions are happening, when during the year they're happening, and who is most likely to be impacted. So this web application, in addition to allowing users to upload their own data, it also allows users to run that analysis on eviction labs, eviction tracking systems, eviction filing data, which they have for over 10 states and 33 cities, and they're adding geographies to that all the time. And so I can just quickly demonstrate what this feat analysis looks like. I have pre-selected the city of Jacksonville, Florida. And so you can, for those of you familiar with this resource, they started collecting this data in 2020 and are updating it generally on a monthly basis. And so there's now a repository for this data for most of the cities and states in here from 2020 onwards. And so the tool basically allows you to see, the volume of eviction filings over time. So this is across all 4 years. You can also look at it on individually by year, and you can just sort of see in Jacksonville the eviction filing rate steadily increasing. You can see where eviction filings are most acute at the census tract level. So, by hovering over each census tract, you can see things like the eviction filing rates. You can see how that eviction filing rate compares to the average in Jacksonville, and a bunch of underlying demographic and socioeconomic variables also at the census tract level. FEAT conducts correlation analysis, which basically means the tool appends American Community Survey data, demographic, socioeconomic, housing data, around 70 variables. And it basically, allows users to just have a better understanding of the characteristics of communities that are most at risk of eviction. So we can see in Jacksonville that, we have a lot more information on how to interpret these findings, but in this case, in Jacksonville, neighborhoods that have, where we're seeing lower levels of educational attainment and higher concentrations of African Americans at the census tract level are likely to see, are more likely to see higher rates of eviction filings. And this is just really a proxy to understand who is most at risk. As most of you know, court data does not generally include any type of demographic information. And then lastly, you can just see where over time, when during the year evictions are ebbing and flowing. And so this is data from all 4 of those years combined. If you go to 2020, as Catherine and Mary were just talking about, you can really see the impact of the eviction filing moratorium. So I just wanted to could do a quick demo of this tool. It is, I think we're dropping the link, and we have a bunch of resources on our website on how to use it. But then the other opportunity that I wanted to share is just that, you know, for jurisdictions who might actually have access to this data, need assistance accessing this data or understanding whether they have the necessary data, we are kind of building off of some statewide pilots that we've conducted over the last year, specifically in Indiana and Arizona and Florida. And we're convening a network of partners at the state and local level where New America will provide technical assistance and guidance on this process, from accessing data from court systems to establishing partnerships with, that bring together the needed mix of skills and kind of human resources and technical capacity to develop meaningful analysis for housing that address the needs of local housing communities. And just to share one quick example, we worked with the Polis Center at Indiana University, Indianapolis, over the course of the last 9 months to help them access eviction and foreclosure data statewide from the Indiana Supreme Court. And they have been able to use that to develop this resource, which they made publicly available in December, that showcases eviction and foreclosure trends statewide in Indiana at various geographic scopes at the county level, at the city level, at the census tract level. It shows evictions in relation to in relation to other states. It pulls in additional data. So I think we're dropping the link to this as well. So I don't want to spend too much time on it, mostly because I want to get to all of your questions. But I just wanted to provide this example of what Indiana was able to do with just a little bit of technical assistance in a fairly short amount of time to really unlock access to this data and share it with the public. And so I will just go back to this slide. We will be sending all these resources out in an email as well, but just if anyone has any questions or would like to learn more about either of these opportunities or resources, please feel free to email me. I put my email here, zainabai@newamerica.org. Yeah, and with that, I will turn it over to Julia.
Great. Thanks so much, Sabiha and Mary, Catherine, Karen, and Lauren. I welcome you to come on video. Well, thank you all for taking us through an incredibly useful whirlwind tour of the various ways that you can use ARPA funds to improve your collection analysis and use of eviction data. So we have about 15 minutes of Q&A, and we have a ton of questions from the audience. So I will just kind of pose these questions to the group. Whoever feels best equipped to answer them, please feel free to jump in, and then we'll just move through them. So the first question is, were local eviction databases originally included as an eligible expense in the original bill? And if not, what was the process to make it an eligible expense? That might be a question for you, Karen.
Sure. So the short answer is no. The language itself doesn't exist in either ARPA's description of state and local fiscal recovery funds, and it even doesn't exist specifically in the Treasury Department, who's responsible for administering the fiscal recovery funds, in the rules or other guidance. However, I hope that you'll see when you get the PowerPoint that I don't think there's any ambiguity about it being an eligible and allowable use when you look at the language that is there around eviction prevention services and the ability of public sector employees to be using data and evaluation and to be spending the funds on all of that. This is how I will make a plug, though, for in the future. When a federal funding source becomes available, is that what ends up in guidance and what ends up in final rules is what the public comments on and asks for clarification. So if there had been a specific request, can an eviction database be, can you spend fiscal recovery funds on an eviction database? We'd have an answer very specifically to that, because the Treasury Department, in preparing its final rules, has to respond to all the public comments. So I think there's just no question that this is really in the sweet spot of so much of what the eviction prevention language and the use of data language is intended to allow.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Karen. Next question is for Catherine. And the question is, how do you approach self-teaching data scraping?
Yeah, sure. So I think for me, it was something that I did have a little bit of, I'll say a little bit of background from grad school. And so that's where I went first, was to go back and look at those resources. But honestly, most of it was taught through YouTube videos and going through, and then a lot of trial and error. I'm also lucky, my brother is an actual developer. And so when I got stuck, I would ask him, but you can look at my code all day long and it is not pretty, but it gets the job done and allows us to do what we needed. But honestly, anything with kind of the time and space, I believe we're all capable in learning and figuring it out. And that there's a lot of great resources, especially when you're looking at like R or Python, some of these, some things that are open source, and there's just like that community around it. And it's free, which is really nice for someone who's thinking about, if you're trying to get scrappy with how you're starting up your database, thinking through what type of publicly available or like free opportunities that you already have is a great way for me to start.
Yeah. Thanks so much, Catherine. And I'll just add to that, as Karen mentioned earlier, as you're thinking through how to use these funds to stand up an eviction database, it's useful to think about the different skill sets that would need to be involved. So you could hire out for somebody to develop this scraping code, for example, and just kind of lay out the different skill sets that would, or somebody, a front-end designer to design a dashboard and so on. So this is definitely an allowable use of funds to hire somebody to develop a code like that. I have a question here. I'm not sure who wants to take this, so I'll kind of throw it out to the group. It's a question about how do you work with courts that have been historically unfriendly about sharing data?
I can just offer a couple of, I don't have a definitive answer to that, but I think in our experience, it's been really helpful in the past when there is a concrete initiative or project or reason as to that you can provide the court with as to why you need this specific data and on what timeline. We have just found that even sometimes engaging with jurisdictions on the development of FEAT, really on the tool that I demoed early on, sometimes in their involvement in a project like that, regardless of how formal or informal it was at the time, helped unlock conversations with courts that were previously sort of deadlocked, and just sort of provided justification. It's not sort of like a surefire, strategy, but I think just having that specific end goal in mind to be able to share, and timeline and purpose, is helpful.
I would add, in addition to those smart comments from Sevilla, is to try to discern what the court's reluctance is about. Is it just a reluctance to be transparent? Maybe instead it's a reluctance because they're using 20th century case management systems and technology, and they don't have the funding to upgrade, and culturally it's so hard to get people to change. I mean, so that if you have the potential to propose, if that's really the obstacle, to come up with ideas and solutions about how you can help the court modernize in those ways, plus the ways that having that data will help them address their backlogs and, have happier litigants and, produce more justice as a result. And so I think it involves really listening and trying to better understand where the reluctance comes from. And then identifying the right partners to be helpful. I like to make offers instead of asks, generally speaking. And that may be an example.
I'll also just add quickly that sometimes we've been successful if certain jurisdictions within a state have opened up their data, then making that argument with other jurisdictions, sort of creating a little bit of a, I don't want to say competitiveness, but it is a little bit of that, sort of saying, hey, the X county was able to stand up this database and it's been super helpful, and kind of getting folks from that county to speak to why it's been helpful. That's been a strategy that we've used in the past. Lauren, this question is for you. How might one go about developing partnerships in order to effectively make the case for using these funds for eviction data purposes?
Yeah, thank you. I think finding a common thread or goal, linking back to the big picture. I think with partnerships, we may all want something different, but if at the end of the day, we want to alleviate or diminish evictions, I think that's an effective way of going about it. I think it's also about education. We can't assume that partners are where you're at. And so how can you bring them along with building it, be it the courts, be it nonprofits or city council or mayors. Also, it's about building trust, and trust is the long game. Having prior to coming to National League of Cities and working in the eviction space in Virginia, it's the long game about building trust, getting people to talk from the same talking points, and seeing the vision that needs to happen. And that's with the courts, that's with city officials and community partners as well. And so bringing people along is going to be very critical to ensure that you have successful solutions, and solutions that are comprehensive and useful to each partner that is sitting around the table.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Lauren. Does anyone else, I know that that's a bit of a broad question, if anybody else wants to come in on that question, would welcome that.
So the only thing I would also add is that it was much easier during when we had a lot of rental assistance kind of flowing, but I think anytime you can, when you're building partnerships, whether it is a landlord or the court system or the housing, whoever it is, making sure that it's not an us versus them mentality, which is, when you're going to court, it naturally feels that way. That's how the case is literally set up. But I think most people don't want to go through the eviction process. The sheriffs don't want to do it. The landlords don't want to do it, right? And so saying that we're all on the same team, at least with our end goal of avoiding eviction, I think, and coming from a human perspective and saying that whatever initiative we're trying to push is with the ultimate goal to help all of us, our community, landlords, the city, the sheriffs, the court system. And I think focusing on that is been what has made it so that we can succeed in building these partnerships and making them enduring and long lasting.
Wonderful, thank you. I have a question here about how do you make sure that you're being good stewards of the data once you've received it?
Great question. Mary and I were actually just talking about that earlier today. I think for us, and again, this was somewhat of helpful to have that infrastructure by being in the city. I had access to a lawyer who reviewed our memorandum of understanding. I also, there were just naturally pressures by using other departments' data to make sure that we had those like very explicit data management processes put in there. I will say that at the height of the pandemic, the height of the crisis, that we were very much prioritizing resource allocation and like trying to share as much information as possible. But now, as especially the growth of the expungements and things like that within our system, of pulling back and being like, okay, how can we make sure that we are putting into place even better data practices as we continue? So I think that's another thing, is that it's also iterative, which can be nice to have someone who's sustainably working on this, or for it to be this database to be housed in a place where it's managed. Because again, as the landscape changes, maybe as laws change, or just as like the environment in which you're working in changes, that you can also be reactive to those data management practices.
Yeah, and I was just going to add on a practical note, I think just as much transparency as possible, and kind of careful attention to ensuring that you're defining every piece of a metric that you're putting out there and what it is, as it relates both to the legal process, but then what it translates into and why it's important, and any caveats or opportunities for it to be misinterpreted, just addressing those. So it's never as simple as just sort of putting out a rate or a metric. It's really kind of all of the things that go around communicating that and making sure that it's being communicated responsibly.
Wonderful. And I'm just going to ask one last question. I know we have several that we haven't gotten to, but we'll send these out to the panelists, and we'll hopefully get some answers that we can communicate after the fact. This is a bit of a broad one, but I think it's very practical and maybe a good way to end on this, or end this webinar on. How do you most effectively actually go about making the justification that this is an allowable use of funds? So who needs to be convinced, and like, what do you do, broadly speaking?
Yeah, I'll jump in here. First, who needs to be convinced? Mayor, city council, or county equivalent, as well as city administration. I think justification, I think a couple of questions that could be asked or help to develop your justification. How does developing a local eviction database links back to your city or county housing plan or strategy? Also another question to consider is, how does developing this database link back to the budget that currently appropriates housing stability or eviction interventions? Also, I think another justification or question to consider is considering how this database can support current or future eviction prevention interventions. So linking it back to the work that city or county government is currently doing to address housing stability as well as housing needs in their community.
That was a great answer. I know we're out of time, but I would just add that the Treasury Department has encouraged all of its recipients of fiscal recovery funds to be thinking about spending on longer term priorities as we get closer to the end of the availability of these funds. And so I think Lauren's answer was really spot on for, for being responsive to what the Treasury Department is saying, because, that includes like making sure to front load the one-time expenditures that are needed to develop it, rather than hiring a whole bunch of new staff who you may run out of funding for. But is to be thinking about the long-term sustainability of the goals of spending the money.
Thanks, Lauren, and thanks, Karen. Well, with that, I'd like to thank everyone so much for tuning in. Thank you to all of our panelists for sharing some really pragmatic and just like practical examples and information. To those tuning in, we will be sending out, in addition to all of the links that Alex kindly dropped in the chat, we'll be sending out a recap email where we'll summarize a bunch of these resources, and we'll include the contact information for everyone on this panel so that you can reach out. We're really happy to answer any questions, see how we can collaborate and work together to improve local eviction data capacity. So with that, thank you all and enjoy the rest of your day.